Hello. When you're running a COBOL program, you can normally add -d to the command line to run the program in COBOL's GUI debugger. But there are occasions when this won't work, and then you'll need to use our remote debugger. Now that's common in these situations on the screen. Anytime you need to debug a remote program when it's running on another computer, and that includes when you're running a program with PuTTY or Charva. Now, if your application is running in a servlet container like Tomcat, or called from another programming language like Java or C++, you'll also need the remote debugger. And you'll use it if you're debugging an application running in COBOL's WebClient, although you should only need to do this if you can't solve the problem when running it from Thin Client first. There are two steps to using the remote debugger. The first one is to set iscobol.runDebug in your program's environment. If you set this to 1, the program will start running immediately and not wait for the debugger to connect. If you set iscobol.runDebug to 2, the execution of the program will stop and wait for a remote debugger connection. A good rule of thumb is to set it to 1 if you're only debugging part of your application, and 2 if you want to debug from the first line of the first program. The default debug port is 9999, but you can set it to a different port with iscobol.debug.port. The second step of using the remote debugger is to start the debugger on your desktop. You'll do this using the command iscrun --d --r, and if you need to, give it the host name and the port. The remote debugger will continue to try to connect to a program. If the remote program was compiled for debug and started with iscobol runDebug set to 1 or 2, then it'll connect to the remote debugger and you can debug on your desktop. So let's take a look at when and how to use this. Let's start with a remote program. I have the program indexed on my CentOS Linux machine along with the data file and a debug properties. Let's take a look at the debug properties. So I've set runDebug to 2. That's the first step. The second step is to start the remote debugger. In this case, I'm going to need the host name, but I don't need the port because it's the default port. And there's the remote debugger listening for a connection. Now I'll run the program, make sure I get my debug properties in there, and the name of the program indexed. And there it is in the remote debugger. Now I'm not going to go through the debugger. I've already made a video on that. You can take a look at it on our YouTube channel. I want to move on to a web service sample. Now I've created a web service using our sans rest sample, and I've deployed it in Tomcat, and I compiled all of the classes for debug, and in the iscobol properties I have set runDebug to 2. So compiled for debug, runDebug for 2. Everything is local. Tomcat is running local, so I don't need an IP address or a port. And then I'll go to my browser and I'll put in the address that I need to call that up, which is that. And at this point, we're not running any COBOL, so we don't have anything in the debugger yet. But if I go to the rich HTML and I call up the first record, now I'm on my rest and I can step through. And that's how I would debug this. I can go to the next program and you can see that it's also debugging sans. So there's how we can debug a web service that's running in a server container. Next, I want to debug in WebClient. And in this case, I'm going to debug our samples program, which has a lot of individual programs, and I only want to debug one part. So I'm going to set iscoboldebug to 1. So let's take a look at that. Now it's running on another Linux, and I have the web client and the application server running. And I have compiled just one of the classes for debug. You can see it here, it's AS handling. And then in my iscobol.properties, at the top I've set runDebug to 1. All right, so let's debug that. Let's start the remote debugger, and the IP address of my web client server. We'll open up a browser window, put in the address for that samples, and we'll go to library routines. And we'll get a $getuser, and it's not displaying, and that's because it's in the debugger. And here's AS handling. So now I am debugging just the one program in a suite of programs in this application. If I were to call up another program that wasn't compiled for debug, like $environment map, the program comes up. It doesn't go into the debugger because it's not compiled for debug. All right, so the last thing that I want to show you is how to debug a COBOL program that's called from another language. And for that, I'm using our COB-var helper sample. And I've compiled all of the COBOL programs for debug. And I've created an isCOBOL.properties. And I'm setting run debug to 2. And in this case, I'm changing the debug port to 1234. So I'm all set up to go. Let's start our remote debugger. And even though it's local, I do need to put the host name and port because I've changed the port number. So we'll say local host and 1234. My remote debugger is listening. Let's run the program. So it did some stuff in the Java program and then stopped when it got to the first COBOL program. And here's our remote debugger on the first program. And then when I exited, it went back to the Java and finished the job. So there you have a look at the remote debugger. If you have any questions, you can contact us at support@variant.com. Thank you.